overview of the recent Supreme Court ruling on the MBTA Communities case. I know there's been a lot of buzz about that, so Chris is going to break it down for us.
Hey everybody, I think I know most of you. I'm sure we've had the chance to chat over the course of the last several months. So I'm Chris Fiorentino. I'm a local criminal defense attorney and personal injury attorney. I've represented some of you on criminal matters. And there's been a recent case that came out about the MBTA Communities Act. And it came across my email the other day, and I got all excited, and I was like, oh, I should share this with the Milton Chamber of Commerce. And then it occurred to me that I don't actually know anything about this law, but by that time I had already volunteered. And so it's too late, and realistically, Mr. Corcoran should probably be the one giving this speech. I'm gonna make a lot of mistakes. Ask him if you have questions afterwards. He'll know this definitely better than me. So I do have a couple of slides to kind of keep me on track. And I just want to talk first about this, like what we're here to talk about, okay? I'm not here to talk about the broad argument that we all feel strongly about whether or not rezoning should happen or shouldn't happen or where it should happen. I'm not here to get into that argument, and I'm unarmed right now. So what I am here to talk about is there was just this court decision that is going to be affecting all of us. And you may be talking about it with your friends at cocktail parties, and I just want to make sure that you know a little bit more than probably anybody else, because nobody actually reads these decisions except lawyers. And you'll have just that much more information the next time you're having a glass of wine with your neighbor, over the kitchen table, okay? So there was this law that came out a number of years ago that many of you, I think, are probably aware of. And the law requires communities that have MBTA service, including Milton, to rezone within half a mile of one of their train stations so that they can have multifamily housing as a matter of right, okay? And what this means is there should be a zone on the zoning map, okay, an area where property owners can put in multifamily housing if they want to. It doesn't require multifamily housing to go in. It doesn't seize anybody's property and force the state to build or property developers to build. It's just if you own the property, then you're allowed to put in multifamily housing if you want to, okay? Now, the town of Milton, we have a zoning plan, okay? And there was this big argument within town meeting and a plan that kind of developed as a result, and they were going to change the zoning plan, okay? However, not everybody was super happy about that, so it went to a referendum. A referendum is a vote, and I imagine many of us voted as to whether or not this plan should be adopted. And at the end of the day, the town voted that we not adopt the plan to change the zoning, okay? And so the town remains out of compliance, okay? And so the Attorney General decided that, despite the fact that we all voted on not changing the plan, that she was going to try to enforce the law, okay? And the way that she chose to enforce the law was to file a lawsuit against the town to make us comply with this law and to install a new zoning plan, okay? And so this is intended to be lighthearted. I hope everybody understands that. But what it does kind of touch on, and this is something that I think anybody is concerned about, is where is the balance between the power of the people to vote on things and where are kind of the limitations of that, okay? And this isn't a pure democracy. We've got an executive and a legislative and a judicial branch, and we don't get to just vote on everything. And where we run to the limitations of democracy can be where the people vote to limit the rights of the minority, okay, or the majority votes to limit the rights of the minority. And so Milton responded to this lawsuit making three basic arguments, okay, to prevent the Attorney General from forcing us to change our zoning plan, okay? And the first argument that Milton made was that this was a problem with separation of powers. See, the way the law works is it created a obligation for an executive agency called HLC, or colloquially called HLC. I'm sure I'm getting that mostly right. To institute guidelines for how this law should be implemented, and the HLC also decides whether or not a town is doing what it's supposed to do according to the law, okay? And so what the town of Milton argued was, hey, these regulations that the HLC adopted, that steals legislative power. And so this is a violation of the separation of powers, okay? Because it's an executive agency as opposed to the legislature coming up with these guidelines, right? We also argued, and by we I mean the town of Milton, not me, that the Attorney General violated the extent of her authority as the Attorney General. See, the law that we have, the law that requires this zoning change, includes penalties for towns if they don't adhere to the law. And towns that don't adhere to the law lose out on economic benefits, okay? And so town of Milton argued, hey, the penalty is we miss out on economic benefits. Go ahead and institute the penalty. That doesn't give the Attorney General the right to file a suit and make us comply with the law. There are limitations on the Attorney General's authority, okay? And then the last argument that we made, almost like a throwaway argument, I think, is that the HLC guidelines that were instituted that tell us how to adhere to the law were improperly adopted. These guidelines, or these regulations that executive agencies adopt, have to be adopted according to a procedure, okay? And this procedure requires that there be a small business plan that go up to, that gets filed with the state, and that also that before the regulations are adopted, that they also be filed with the Secretary of State's office, okay? Or Secretary of the Commonwealth's office. And those two things weren't done. So we basically, the town found what some people would say to be kind of like loopholes with the law, okay? So this argument went all the way up to the Supreme Judicial Court. The Supreme Judicial Court is like Massachusetts Supreme Court, okay? So there's state law, and then there's federal law, and we're all familiar with the Supreme Court, right? Massachusetts Supreme Court is called the SJC, the Supreme Judicial Court. And whenever there's arguments in the state court, appellate arguments in the state court, they can find themselves at the Supreme Judicial Court. And that's what's happened here, okay? This issue was decided by the Supreme Judicial Court. And the thing about decisions that come from the Supreme Judicial Court is that they're pretty much final, okay? So if the Supreme Judicial Court says, hey, this is the law, this is what's gonna happen, there's no real appellate authority for us to go past unless there's constitutional issues, and then we could maybe petition the Supreme Court. In a case like that, I personally think that that's unlikely. I think this is going to stay at the state level, okay? All right, so what did the court end up saying, okay? The court ended up saying on this violation of separation of powers agreement that the HLC and their right to set forth these regulations does not violate the separation of powers. There are all kinds of executive agencies that put forth regulations all the time, and just because they're doing that doesn't mean that they're stepping on the legislature's toes, okay? And I think probably most of us who work in the business are not particularly surprised that this argument was a failed argument, okay? What I think is most interesting is this argument here that the Attorney General is stepping outside of her boundaries. You know, the law doesn't create this right for her to file this lawsuit, but she did it anyway. And the Supreme Judicial Court said, you know, we recognize that the law has a penalty built into it, but nevertheless, the Attorney General's office has this power to enforce the law very broadly. And where the rights of the public are at stake, even if the legislative documents don't create this power, they have the Attorney General's office has a really broad authority to stand up on behalf of the people broadly and enforce the law. And so that was a bit surprising to me, because this isn't, you know, really the law that I practice. Again, I do mostly criminal and personal injury law, and I don't run into this kind of stuff very frequently. And the question that it makes me ask myself is like, well, what are the ends of the Attorney General's powers? You know, if there are powers that the Attorney General has, and they're not really written down anywhere, then how do we know when we've reached the end of those powers? And so it makes me wonder if at some point in time the Attorney General might overstep those boundaries, and then we run into really another separation of powers type agreement where, you know, she's creating law through maybe executive order, or she's representing parties that she doesn't really have the right to represent. And the short of it is, like, I don't know, but it's something that all of us as Americans should be concerned about, because part of being an American is being sort of a little bit distrustful of government overreach, okay? And then the last argument, this HLC guidelines were improperly adopted because they didn't adhere to this procedure that they were supposed to. The case ended up turning on this argument, like the least interesting argument. And the Supreme Judicial Court basically came down and said, like, hey, when the state or when executive boards are going to adopt regulations, they have to adhere very carefully to this procedure. And if they don't, then the guidelines are unenforceable. And so they ended up basically kicking this to a future date. The fight is really not over, okay? And so where are we today? Like, what can the town do? Okay, what are our options? And I'm now stepping well outside my professional experience, okay? But my understanding of what we can do is we can adopt our new plan, you know, through the town meeting process, independently, through rezoning, okay? Or we can keep fighting with the Attorney General and ideally win or lose or whatever that's gonna go on, and probably a ton of lawyers will become rich as a result. So that's great. Sorry to hear that I won't be one of those lawyers, but again, I don't know what I'm talking about, so they shouldn't pay me to do that. And then the last thing that could happen is our legislators could change the law. Okay, so if it were to happen that the law were to be amended so that the law doesn't apply to Milton, or it applies to Milton differently, then that's a real option for us. In advance of preparing for today, I reached out to our state senator, Bill Driscoll, and then also there are two state reps that represent the town of Milton. Okay, and I'm not gonna name them because they didn't respond to me, but Bill Driscoll did, and he got back to me like within 24 hours, gave me his thoughts, and there is going to be some legislative proposals that are coming through. So, you know, I guess he's going to do his work to try to maybe tighten this up. And I don't know if that's going to be successful or not, but I think all of us are interested to know that the state senator is, you know, super responsive to contact by the people. I'm not special. He got back to me like, I think he would probably get back to any one of us. So anyway, that's my presentation. If anybody has any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. Okay.
That's great. Thank you.
See you guys next time.